Hi there, I'm David Benites, and this is Extreme Vocal Institute. And this week, we're going to be talking about the new challenge that's been cycling around Instagram and Facebook the past couple of days, and that is the Metal Vocal Power Challenge. Personally, I like the amount of these that have been going around lately, and especially given the state of the world at the moment, it's really good to have something like this out there to kind of bring people together and also create something more community-based and something more interactive and kind of show people what you can do. And it also does feel good to show off sometimes. Now, on the other side of that coin, specifically with this one, I think the title and what people are doing in this brings up an important point. For those of you that don't know what this is, it's essentially taking a quick selfie video of yourself very, very close to your face and making as loud and expressive a scream as you can and just ripping into it and showing what you can do. Now, although that is fun in the moment, I think this kind of pushes the idea of you need to be able to be as powerful as possible in order to sound good. And this brings up an important misconception about power and tone. Power and tone are not the same thing. And I think there are some people out there that may be a bit confused by this at first, especially because for people just starting out and people who are self-taught, the way we learn to make these expressive and emotive sounds is by doing just that, by expressing ourselves and being emotional and pouring everything we've got into the sound, because we only get involved in this in the first place because we have something we want to express and say. So it's a very intense, very powerful thing, and that's how it starts for most people. It definitely did for myself as well. However, there are ways to get these big, intense sounds to happen and happen fully with the amount of depth and intensity you want without having to use all that energy and without having to squeeze every muscle in the body and rip yourself into it in order to get it to happen. Now, in this video, we're going to be talking about how you can achieve real vocal power through increasing your tone and how to take your voice to new levels and make yourself sound better. And there are a couple of things to think about when it comes to this, when it comes to your tone. And it's understanding the differences between volume and dynamic control. Tension versus relaxing into movements. Sheer push versus balancing your way into your sounds. It's important to understand what projection actually is, and then feel the differences over time between power and sound intensity. And we're going to be talking about all of these things at length here. Now, with volume, it's important to understand that you don't have to be the loudest person in the room in order to sound good. This type of vocal is not meant to be done acoustically. This was more so designed and makes the most sense in context with a band, which means electronic equipment is involved. So there are tools assisting in your ability to hear what's going on vocally in context with everything else. So when it comes to volume on your own, acoustically, you don't have to be super, super, super loud in order for what you're doing to be considered correct. Even though there are others that may disagree with that and may say things along the lines of you need to throw your whole person into the sound and you need to be really loud when you're recording or at practice or on your own or at shows. If you more so understand dynamic control, that will help you create that type of intensity, but in a way where you can be the one in charge. So you're never going so far off the handle that you lose that control and then end up hurting yourself. For example, it's important to understand that volume is relative to where the starting point is. Depending on where you're starting from with your own songs, songs you're covering, songs you're practicing to, whatever. If there's no contrast in what you're doing and everything is just firing on all cylinders at all times, there's going to be no dynamics to it. And even if you're pushing really, really hard and you're singing and screaming really loud, that will kind of get lost because in context with everything else, it will all kind of just feel and sound the same. Versus dynamic control, understanding how to start small, how to create intensity in terms of your ability to grow into bigger sound in context with what you're doing. And then you're able to create these very big shifts in intensity and in volume without having to go as loud as you can. And yet this will actually be perceived as louder and more intense because of where you came from with that type of sound. That's essentially the basics of dynamic control and creating those moments and those peaks and valleys in terms of how much or how little you're using your volume at any given time. Now, on top of this, it's important to note that just squeezing isn't how we want to get the sound out either. With a lot of the vocal challenge videos, especially, there's a lot of this emphatic head throwing and like neck tension and the face getting all red and the chest squeezing and all of this different movement, which is kind of incorporated into performance as well, because you don't want to just stand there like a stick. You want to move around. You want to, again, express yourself, because that's the point. But you don't need to rely on all of this tension just to get the sound out or to be able to make it sound good. If you can relax your way into these movements and more so balance what's going on, you won't have to squeeze as much. And instead, what you'll feel is resonance. If I tighten up my whole body here and then try and sing a note, it comes out, but you can hear it wavering a little bit, and the sound is kind of thin. To paint a picture, it kind of takes up like this space. Versus my speaking voice, you can hear it kind of open up. You can kind of hear that size change. Versus if I relax the sound and allow other parts of the vocal tract and the body to actually vibrate and resonate and shake with the sound because of how loose I am, much bigger sound, much more of it. And all I did was allow this to happen. It's not something I had to make happen. You can't muscle your way into everything, because that's just not how the human voice or sound in general works. The more you can work with yourself, the more sound you'll be able to make. And the more relaxed you are, the more things will vibrate with you, which will create more and more sound without you having to do anything. And then you'll feel not just the intense feeling. Instead of a squeeze, it'll be all this vibration and all this energy cycling about your body, but you'll also feel the size difference in the sound you're making being much more intense, and that opens up a lot more doors in terms of what you can do with it. Now, this will only happen, again, if you balance it, which means you don't want to just push as hard as you can in terms of your air support. The way you handle your breathing in these types of moments is important, and when you're working on things like tone and improving your sound, if you're just pushing as hard as you can all the time, you're going to really bring a lot of wear and tear into this area and into all of the muscles and structures responsible for sound creation. When it comes to the sheer amount of force that we're capable of implementing with the diaphragm versus how delicate all of these muscles and membranes are up here, the diaphragm will always win. The air will always win. And even if it takes some time, that wear and tear is going to get the best of you, and these structures are going to give up, and that's where damage happens. The overuse of air is the most common reason why people hurt themselves. It happens the most often. So, because of this, especially with metal vocals, you don't want to overdo it in this aspect. Every kind of sound you want to make has some sort of balance with your air pressure to make it happen in the optimal way. Like with a fry vocal, for example, if I pushed too hard on that very delicate sound, it kind of closes up a little bit, and you can hear how other parts of the throat are starting to get involved and are cinching shut. That's because if you use too much force, you're creating that internal conflict within your own body, and you're getting this happening instead of things working together, if that makes sense. Now, if I use the appropriate amount of air pressure, now the sound comes out in a more intense way without me having to push as hard as I can. Same with the deeper, more intense sounding false chord. Balanced versus not balanced. And you can see how my entire body even folded a little bit. And a lot of the depth was lost. Even though there was more of this going on with the direction of the sound, you lose so much of it that it's not really big anymore. It's not really powerful anymore. So if you're squeezing as hard as you can, you're actually losing power, not gaining it. From here, going off of the direction thing, it's important to understand what projection actually is. And this is feeling your ability to control the direction you're sending your sound in at any given moment. In different contexts, like for example, any kind of performance art like musical theater, when you're learning these kinds of things for the first time, oftentimes people are instructed to kind of pick something on the wall or choose someone in your audience to kind of aim your sound at. And the more you can do that, you'll feel your ability to kind of just focus the sound in whatever direction you choose. It's more of a reflex than anything else, and even though there are many moving parts to how this is done and how different things vibrate in different places, it starts with thought, it starts with intention. So if you can aim your sound, can turn into sending the sound forward and outward and at something. With the screams, versus I'm sending the sound out in a more intentional way. And that started here, and because of that, what I've done is I've triggered a physical response. This is very important to note because I didn't have to use every muscle in my body and just clench in order to force the sound to fly out. I can just imagine that sensation, think about aiming in a direction, and fire away. And after time and practice, you'll be able to get that same sort of thing to happen. Additionally, other forms of projection live up here. For example, anytime you say a word that starts with a vowel, A, E, I, O, U, anything that starts with those A, E, O, U kind of sounds, you hear that light popping. We're using this area here called the pharynx to change the shape that the sound is traveling through to get out of your body, and that projects the sound as well. It's distorting it further and sending the sound out in a different way. The difference between a standard note and a belted one is this. Now, if you do that with your scream, you can turn a calmer, let's say a lower scream, that has a lot of depth, but not that much intensity or ferocity. And instead of just pushing and squeezing for power, using what I understand about projection here and here, I can create a more intense, more powerful sound with added direction and fuller tone. Now, this kind of leads me to my final point, which is the difference between power and sound intensity. All we're talking about here is our perception of the sound, which means the way we're creating sound is changing the way the ear is hearing it, which changes the way we feel about it. So it's all about changing the way the sound travels and changing the way the ear hears it. Because it's all about change, and it's all about being able to keep flexible enough to create these changes, that means power doesn't come from squeeze, and that means power doesn't come from push or from volume. It comes from flexibility and intention. Additionally, from here, all metal vocals are, and all any type of distortion is in general, is just overtone work. and how many of these different overtones and harmonics you can add and stack on top of each other with your sound or take away. As I've talked about in other videos on our channel about how screams and pitch are related, you'll hear the more distorted the sound is, the more scream-like it is, and the more of those overtones you take away, the more you hear what's happening underneath in the vocal cords, and you can hear the true tone. So the intensity and the power of the scream is just how many of the overtones there are and how consistent they are. And you are actually in control of that. Like any other reflex, for example, if I hold my hand up and I'm like, can I wiggle my finger? I don't really think about it. I just do it. And I'm not thinking about all of these moving parts going all the way up to the finger. I'm just doing it because everything is already lined up and the body already knows how to do this. You can train this similar reflex with your sound intensity. For example, if I sing a note here, and I intensify that sound, thinking of it in this same way, not thinking about necessarily how or all of the different things involved, but just intensify. You can hear the size change, and you can hear the amount of overtones and the distortion within the sound change. If I do the same thing with a scream of any sort, false chord for example, versus fry, I can do the same thing and intensify what's going on. And because of keeping loose and because of how balanced I am in the moment, more overtones form by themselves, and I'm able to stack more and more on top of each other to distort the sound more, which creates a deeper and richer and fuller tone. And like I said, this changes the way you hear it. This changes the way the eardrum responds. This changes how you feel about it. And because of that feel change, now you sense power behind the sound. Even though I didn't just get louder, I didn't just squeeze, I didn't just push, I didn't just use too much air, I didn't just shout it out, I intensified. Now, all of these things are important to keep in mind when you're working on your tone and you're just working on yourself in general. And it's important to note that you don't have to be the loudest person in the room. You don't have to push as hard as you can or squeeze every muscle in the body in order to have a powerful voice. And on top of that, keep in mind that everybody sounds a little bit different as well, and you are going to have the sound you have. So learn to be flexible within what you have already, and you'll be able to unlock true power. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, scream responsibly.